Hello to anyone that may be watching this. I have not officially launched this channel yet, but I basically had some thoughts about the latest House of the Dragon episode that I wanted to express somewhere, and I thought maybe this would be a good test run of a video for this channel. So I'm just going to get right into it. Like many people, I thoroughly enjoyed the latest episode of House of the Dragon, which was titled The Red Dragon and the Gold, in which we saw the Battle of Rook's Rest depicted. But one question that I've seen come up a lot in some of the discussion surrounding this episode is why Rhaenys went back to fight Vhagar not once, but seemingly twice. I do follow a handful of other YouTube channels that discuss this show, and some of those have addressed this question, and some of them have addressed it fairly well. However, I do think that, at least as I see it, there are some more specific nuances to her decision that I haven't really seen brought up. That said, at least some of what I'm about to say, I'm sure, has already been talked about a lot, and I don't pretend to be aware of every single conversation that exists around the show, so maybe the entirety of what I'm about to say here is more widely realized than I have come across. But basically, if we go back to the penultimate episode of last season, which ended with Rhaenys breaking out of the dragon pit with her dragon Meleys and seemingly considering killing all of the Greens. In an instant, she could have taken out Otto Hightower, Criston Cole, Alicent, and all of her children with Viserys, and essentially every single threat to Rhaenyra's claim that there could have been. She would undoubtedly have completely prevented the war if she had done this. That is, of course, what a lot of viewers found frustrating about the fact that she didn't go through with it. And while I myself wasn't completely sure of how I felt about that scene when I first saw it, I do think the show did a good job of establishing why she couldn't bring herself to do that. The prior few episodes leading up to this scene showed Rhaenys suffer the loss of both of her children. First her daughter, and then within a month or so after that, her son dies too, as far as she knows. And so when we get to episode 9 and Queen Alicent comes to Rhaenys and pleads with her to join them and to help her, Rhaenys does come to understand Alicent's perspective, even though she doesn't agree with it. And more importantly, she empathizes with her as a mother trying to protect her children. And so when you get to that climactic scene of the episode, and Alicent throws herself in front of her children, or at least one of them, that's why Rhaenys is unwilling to murder them all. And of course, as we know, because she didn't take that opportunity, shortly thereafter, Lucerys is killed by Aemond on Vhagar. And at the start of this season, Daemon rightly points out to Rhaenys that if she had taken that opportunity, then Luke would still be alive.
If you'd have acted when you had the chance, Aegon's line would be extinguished, and Luke would be alive.
And her expression when Daemon says this, at least as I read it, does betray some level of guilt over this. But throughout the first half of this season, as well as the finale of last season, Rhaenys has been pretty clear in her desire to avoid war. She seems to have a pretty good grasp of how awful that would be. And so she has very much supported Rhaenyra's attempts to try and avoid war, or even encouraged her to reach out to Alicent after the death of her son, and after the death of Alicent's grandson.
There may be another way. Alicent Hightower. She came to me in the hours after your Lord Father's death. She knows war is coming, and that it'll be savage beyond all compare. There is no war so hateful to the gods as a war between kin. And no war so bloody as a war between dragons.
So as war has been becoming more and more inevitable, that feeds into the guilt Rhaenys feels over having not seized her opportunity to prevent war. As distasteful as she undoubtedly still finds the idea of burning them all that way, I think she recognizes that the war that is becoming more and more likely and unavoidable is going to be thousands of times more horrific than that one act would have been. Which brings us to this latest episode. Rhaenyra returns from King's Landing and lets her council know that she met with Alicent in a final attempt to avoid war. And she informs them that this attempt was unsuccessful, and they have no choice but to move forward. She is then made aware of Criston Cole's impending attack on Rook's Rest, which, as a quick sidebar, I do think it's also worth addressing why it doesn't occur to any of the Blacks that it might be a trap. It's established at the beginning of the season that King's Landing would be left vulnerable if Aemond wasn't there with Vhagar. And realistically, as far as I understand it at least, Vhagar's really the only dragon that would have a really good chance of killing one of Rhaenyra's older, more experienced dragons. And considering that Rook's Rest is such an insignificant castle, I think it makes sense that they didn't anticipate a dragon to be traveling with that army, especially when, alternatively, it could be protecting King's Landing. Obviously, they would not have anticipated that the entire point of attacking Rook's Rest was to lure a dragon so that the dragons could fight, because it is indeed a pretty risky and ballsy move on the part of Criston Cole and Aemond. I think that the assumption the Black Council makes that the attack on Rook's Rest is purely to demoralize at least a part of Rhaenyra's council, I do think them coming to that conclusion makes a lot of sense. And I also think it makes sense that it did not occur to them that Criston Cole's actual goal was so much more ambitious. And because of that, sending only one dragon does make the most sense. Because similarly to what I was just saying about King's Landing, to send more than one of their strongest dragons away from Dragonstone would leave them vulnerable. And so, because Rhaenyra and Jace are essentially eliminated because of their importance, and Rhaenys wouldn't want her granddaughter sent, she volunteers. And again, I think that guilt is another layer of her motivation. She doesn't want any of these other people that she cares about to get killed in this war that she could have prevented. So she flies to Rook's Rest, and then the first potential threat that she encounters is King Aegon on Sunfire. And I think Rhaenys immediately, and rightly, sees this as an opportunity, a new opportunity, to end this war before it gets too bloody. I think in that moment, she thinks that if she's able to kill Aegon, then that will bring the Greens to the table to negotiate peace. And at first, things seem to be going her way. Until Aemond shows up on Vhagar, and to her surprise, Aemond seems to attack Aegon. Or at the very least, he is obviously not at all concerned with preventing Aegon's death. And so when Aegon and Sunfire fall, this is the first moment where Rhaenys has the opportunity to retreat. And she does seem to be doing so at first, But my interpretation of that scene and what's going on in her head, which I haven't seen anybody bring up as of yet, is that she realizes that Aegon being dead, which may be what she just saw happen, would probably put Aemond on the throne. And I think after just watching what Aemond did to his own brother, she now realizes that Aegon being dead and Aemond being in his place would actually be far worse than the situation that existed prior to this battle. The fact that Aemond isn't even attempting to pursue her after Aegon has crashed to the ground also likely tells her that what Aemond did was intentionally aimed at Aegon. And so she feels that now, once again, she is faced with an opportunity to stop this war from escalating and becoming as awful as it is undoubtedly going to become. And she cannot turn her back on that opportunity again. Even knowing that there's a good chance she could fail, if there's any chance she can prevent this war and prevent more of the people she loves from getting killed in it, she absolutely cannot allow herself to pass up on this opportunity again. So she goes back and engages with Aemond and Vhagar. And for what it's worth, she actually does a pretty good job of holding her own when they first clash. She manages to bring Aemond and Vhagar crashing down to the ground. And so instead of fleeing after that, she goes back to hopefully finish the job. Of course, when she returns to the battlefield, she doesn't find them on the ground any longer, and she's scanning the sky above her, and unfortunately, her and Meleys are blindsided by Vhagar. As someone that has not read Fire and Blood, but has read the illustrated The Rise of the Dragon, and therefore has a fairly clear understanding of the events that have yet to pass, I really appreciated how good a job this episode did fleshing out the motives of all three of the dragon riders that clash by the end of this episode. This was an episode that was so good that it honestly did make me regret knowing what I already knew. I couldn't help but imagine watching this episode without knowing what was going to happen, and I do think that that would have increased my enjoyment of it. Don't get me wrong, I have enjoyed watching the series up to this point and being able to appreciate the little seeds that they're laying that, you know, are leading to something that won't come to pass until much, much later. But that's the type of thing that would be cool to kind of discover on a rewatch after the show's over. So more and more I kind of find myself wishing that I didn't know as much as I do. Anyways, the point is that I knew going into this episode that it was going to more than likely end with the Rook's Rest battle, and therefore that we were going to see Aegon, Aemond, and Rhaenys fight on their dragons, and I knew what the end result of that would be. But I thought the way that this episode especially, but even some of the preceding episodes, built up all three of these characters' motivations going into this battle, I think that made it so much more fascinating and interesting than it is just reading it in the quote-unquote history book. Indeed, I really like what they've done with Aemond, where, you know, they established him last season as this bullied kid who really wasn't that nasty of a child. In fact, you see him at Laena's funeral, you know, he almost tries to express sympathy toward Luke, and Luke seems to just be put off by it. And so you feel bad for Aemond as this bullied, disliked child. But then when he claims Vhagar and he has this taste of real power and feeling superior to all of the people, or, you know, specifically the other children around his age that, you know, treat him like he's worthless and undesirable, now that he feels superior to them in this way, that's kind of where you see that other side get born. And of course, losing his eye only intensifies the animosity. But I really like how they showed that Aemond didn't intend to kill Luke, and that he did feel some remorse for that. And basically, yeah, the last couple episodes had shown that Aemond does still have that sensitive side to him. Unfortunately, his brother discovers that and mercilessly teases him about it, making Aemond ashamed and, kind of reject that side of himself again. And of course, that brings us to this episode where, of course, Aemond decides to just embrace his full dark side, which Jaehaerys' death almost certainly plays a role in what Aemond decides to do in the moment. Because unlike in the books, Aegon seems to have only had the one son. And so when Jaehaerys dies, that seems to make Aemond the heir to the throne, which of course is just one more way that Aemond parallels Daemon. Daemon was the younger brother who felt he was better suited to the throne than his older brother. But Daemon never went so far as to betray his brother in an attempt to take the throne for himself. And that seems to be, at least in my opinion, what Aemond has done. I don't think Aemond was plotting to kill or dispose of his brother in any way prior to this, but I think he saw an opportunity when Aegon showed up to this battle and took full advantage of it. But on the topic of Jaehaerys, just real quick, I did want to briefly touch on how they did change the blood and cheese incident, specifically by removing the younger son that Aegon also had in the books. I was a bit disappointed in that change because I do think that it's more brutal and traumatic in the books.
Blood and Cheese demanded she choose which son would be ripped from her forever. Queen Helena pleaded with the men to kill her instead, but they refused. Weeping, Helena named her younger son, Maelor. Perhaps she thought the boy was too young to understand. Or perhaps because the older boy was King Aegon's firstborn son and heir. You hear that, little boy? Cheese whispered to the younger son. Your mama wants you dead. Then blood struck off the older boy's head with a single blow. When the guards burst in, they found Queen Helena still screaming, clasping her dead son's body to her, mad with grief.
That said, I think if I was unaware of how it played out in the books, that scene would feel more than brutal enough. I don't think that I would be complaining or criticizing that it wasn't brutal enough. And now I obviously kind of understand why they changed it, because they wanted to get rid of the younger son so that Aemond would have this motivation, or this potential motivation. My point with that is just that that's one more thing where I kind of wish I was going into the show more blind, because if I didn't know what happened with Blood and Cheese in the books, I would not have been in any way underwhelmed with what happened in the show. So if there's anybody out there that's watching or listening to this who hasn't read the books but is thinking about doing so, I would say as long as the show continues to be as good as it is, wait until it is over and then go and read the books, and then you can kind of appreciate what was there to begin with and what they actually fleshed out much more. But all right, I think that's everything that I wanted to ramble about in regards to this episode. Like I said at the start of this, I have not officially launched this channel. I have a separate YouTube channel where I talk specifically about the TV series Lost, and I have created this channel so that I can talk about other shows and movies and just other topics in general that I would like to sometimes make videos and video essays about. I am very open to doing more videos about House of the Dragon. I'm sure I'll even want to do more as the show continues to progress. This is really the only show right now that I'm watching week to week. There are some other shows that have been airing that I intend to or am considering watching and binging once they're over. For example, The Boys, I've watched the first 3 seasons of that show as they've aired over the years, and I'm a big fan of that show, but every season I always wait until all 8 episodes are out and then I binge it. So I may or may not want to share some of my thoughts regarding that show once the season's over and I, catch up to everybody else. Another show that I honestly am not sure if I want to watch or not is The Acolyte. I honestly had Star Wars fatigue before a lot of people that now have Star Wars fatigue had it. I watched the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian and liked them well enough, but I was really not a fan of the sequel trilogy. I was horribly disappointed in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. And after hearing quite a lot about the Book of Boba Fett and the Ahsoka show, I just had no interest in either of those. I initially had no interest in Andor either, but because of how acclaimed that show was by critics and fans alike, I did end up giving that a chance, and I did find that worthwhile. So all of that's to say, I'm not terribly invested in Star Wars media these days, but if I were to hear something was good, then I would of course watch it. And, when I became aware of the premise of The Acolyte before it began airing, I did find that interesting. But everything that I've been hearing about it is that it's pretty awful. It sounds like it's more along the lines of the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. So yeah, I'm not overly interested in watching that, but there is still a part of me that's very curious to see just how bad it is, or, if maybe the negativity is a bit overblown. So yeah, my point is that, I don't really know yet what my next video on this channel is going to be. Those are a couple of possibilities. I know that there are all kinds of shows and movies that have existed for a long time that I am interested in talking about. And so yeah, if you just stumbled across this video and found it at all worth your time, please do subscribe and come back for whatever else may come. Until then, may the gods smile upon you. I'm not even sure if that's what they say.